In this video, we'll introduce the idea of key squares. Squares which, if occupied by the white king, force a win, regardless of whose move it is. The idea of key squares gives us a fast and easy way to evaluate whether the pawn will promote. The opposition is a way of forcing the other king to give ground, to step aside. When used offensively, trying to promote the pawn, it allows one king to outflank the other. When used defensively, it allows one king to block the other king's progress. The opposition is a powerful tool, but whether the opposition actually does anything depends entirely on the position, as we've seen in previous videos. Now we introduce key squares. Key squares are those squares which, if occupied by the stronger side's king, guarantee pawn promotion, regardless of whose move it is. This feature of key squares, being independent of who has the move, makes the idea different from that of opposition. Key squares don't replace the opposition. Rather, key squares encode what we've already learned about the opposition. Key squares tell us very quickly whether the stronger side's king can make progress. When a pawn is on the second, third, or fourth ranks, the key squares are 3 squares, 2 ranks in front of the pawn. For example, with a white pawn on c4, the key squares are b6, c6, and d6. Beginners are sometimes taught to think of the shape of the letter T. This might be helpful. Note that as the pawn advances, the key squares change. For a pawn on e2, the key squares are d4, e4, and f4. When the pawn moves to e3, the key squares now change to d5, e5, and f5. For a pawn on the 5th rank, the key squares are different. Now the key squares are 3 squares, 1 rank, and 2 ranks in front of the pawn, 6 squares in all. Let's see an example. Here the pawn is on d2, the king on e2, and black's king on d5. White certainly must take the opposition in front of his pawn. However, using the idea of key squares will help us manage the entire process of moving forward and promoting the pawn. The key squares are c4, d4, and e4, marked in green. White understands that his king must be able to occupy a key square if he is to promote the pawn. White correctly plays king d3, taking the opposition and fighting for access to a key square. Black steps aside, king c5, and now king e4. White's king occupies a key square. It is now clear that with correct play, white will win. A typical move for black is to play king d6. We will look at that later. However, what if black plays king c4? The experienced player understands that this position is completely winning. However, can key squares help? Yes. White can see that the move d3 advances the key squares to c5, d5, and e5, and that the white king will still be able to occupy one of them. So white plays d3. Now, king c5, king e5, white continues to occupy a key square, and black plays king c6. d4. The key squares move again. King d7, king d5, king c7, king e6. The white king has occupied the 6th rank. Play continues. King d8, d5. With the pawn on the 5th rank, the key squares expand. Now there are 6 of them. In this position, promotion easily follows. King e8, d6, king d8, d7, king c7, king e7. and the pawn promotes. Let's back up. In this position, after black's king c4, we demonstrated that white could play d3, but white could also play d4, with the key squares now c6, d6, and e6. Black can still do nothing to prevent white's king from occupying a key square. King b5, king d5, or king e5, king b6, king d6. It is clear that the pawn will promote. Let's go back. From the starting position, white takes the opposition and now occupies e4, a key square. Now black plays king d6. What should white do? There are two moves that look tempting for beginners, and key squares help us avoid both. d4, a typical move made by players who want to rush their pawn forward. Pawns must be pushed is a common refrain. Good advice in some situations. This is not one of them. d4 puts the key squares beyond the reach of the white king. Now, black blocks, and the game is drawn. The move d3 also looks tempting. It appears conservative, safe, it must be at least okay. But notice what happens. The key squares have moved, and now black's king can take the opposition and block. The white king will never occupy a key square now. This game is also drawn. But what should white play? It might be surprising to learn that the only move for white in this position is king d4. The student of the game is encouraged to prove to his own satisfaction that all other moves draw. Play might continue. King c6, king e5, king d7, king d5, king c7, king e6. The white king has reached the 6th rank, and now king d8. If black decides to oscillate his king on the d8 and e8 squares, play might continue. The idea of key squares is a powerful technique that allows us to recognize winning and drawn endings almost instantly. They work and are understandable because we've already seen how kings try and use the opposition to block and outflank, and also positions where the opposition does and doesn't matter, and how pawn rank changes the position. Key squares are simply a compressed version of these ideas. In this series, we started with the basic mechanics and worked our way through the opposition, its successes, and its failures. In this video, we've seen how those ideas can be summarized using key squares, giving us a faster and more reliable way to evaluate the position. In the next video, we'll look at some practical examples. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.